Hello crafty friends, it's Jess from jesscrafts.com and today I'm here with a Copic background tutorial. So this is an image from Stamp Anniething, and this image was provided for free for people who are participating in a card swap at Stamp Anniething. So I printed the digital image and colored it up, and I'm not going to share how I colored the digital image just because a lot of the techniques are directly ones that I learned from Kitten Clowder classes, and so I don't want to necessarily be, sharing someone else's tutorial. However, I can highly recommend Kitten Clowder, and I'll leave you a link to them in the video description. But today's video is going to focus on the background, and so you could recreate a similar classroom background for any school stamps. There is, while this image was provided for free, there is a teacher stamp in the Stamp Anniething line, and I'll also leave you a link to their Facebook group where you can find out more about future card swaps. So here I'm drawing in my background, and I'm sketching lightly with a pencil, and it's just, a standard mechanical pencil. I happen to like this one because it has a really big eraser, and so I'm not, like a lot of times with mechanical pencils, the eraser is gone before I've even used up like the first bit of lead. Although I've actually found a really good art eraser that I like to use now for, specifically for working on art things. But what I'm trying to draw here is a chalkboard and then a wooden floor underneath. So you're going to see that little gap area with the eraser on top is going to be the ledge of the chalkboard. There's going to be a gap for the wall, and then there's going to be the floor at the bottom. And so I'm kind of labeling that there so it's a little bit more obvious what I'm doing. However, that was not a very good idea because that pencil line on the edges there is going to be pulled up by my marker, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But when I go to lay down my marker, I have to erase the pencil lines. So it might seem kind of silly to draw them in the first place, but I like to get an idea for what I'm doing. And at this point in the video, I'm sort of trying to freehand it, but you certainly could use your T-ruler. And I highly recommend a T-ruler over a regular ruler just because they're so widely available, so cheap, and they allow you to draw straight lines with ease. So I use that, and later on I'll use my T-ruler to draw in some of the Copic coloring lines. The only thing to consider with that is that it's going to color your T-ruler because your T-ruler is plastic or usually plastic or metal, either way, non-porous surface, but alcohol inks will color non-porous surfaces. So you may have to use some rubbing alcohol or a Copic blender to get it off. Now I'm starting to color in the wall with YG11, and here is where I pick up some of that pencil line, so the pencil marks I made there to write down what I was drawing. And Copic will trap the color pencil underneath, and it makes it pretty tricky to get it up. A Tombow sand eraser is probably your best bet, but it's not going to be perfect. And so here I decide to erase all of that. But as you can see, even the part that I touch with my Copic marker, it's like trapped there underneath the marker. So you have to be really careful, and that's why it's so important to erase your pencil lines, especially if you're going to be using lighter colors. And I'll link to the Tombow eraser and the other eraser that I really like, because the other one, you don't even have to draw that light, and it comes off your cardstock really easy. So to color this wall, I picked some relatively light green colors just because I wanted to stick with, they're not really primary colors because primary is red, blue, and yellow, but those sort of like bright colors that people often associate with schools. Now, as a teacher, I can tell you that schools often have very odd paint colors. I don't know why, but sometimes they're just like, I wonder, like, did they get them on discount or something? Because they can be really strange colors sometimes. But I wanted the imaginary classroom to have really bright, fun walls. So I'm going to color this green here. And I'm using YG 17, 13, and 11. I laid down an overall coat of the 11 underneath, found that my YG 11 was running kind of dry. And now that I've started to color more Copic backgrounds, I haven't done a lot of tutorials with them yet because I want to make sure that my tutorials are truly my own and I'm not just showing you something that someone else showed and taking credit for their work. So I wanted to, make sure that I was getting practiced and learning my own things first. But anyway, as I've started to color more of my own backgrounds, I have found that it has been really important to collect the re-inkers for my Copics. And I think that this is a great investment. Copics are very expensive. There's no doubt about that. And well, the thing to consider is while they are very expensive, when you buy a Copic marker, it's for life. If your nib gets a little bit messed up, you can replace the nib. When it runs out of ink, you can put more ink in it. You don't have to give up on the marker just because something's going wrong with it, which is true of a lot of cheaper markers. So I just think that it's important to take into consideration if you're the kind of person who's going to be coloring a lot and you really enjoy coloring. You've had Copic markers for a while, and I've had them for years before I started buying refills. At first I'd only buy like what I really needed, but I found that I need a lot more now that I color big backgrounds. Anyway, you can look at the price of it across each time you fill the marker. And I've recently found that Scrapbook Pal has great prices on Copic markers. They're like always about 40% off, and the refills are about half price. They retail for $9, they sell them for $4.55. Great deals, and it's really helped me to build my collection on a budget. Anyway, coloring the chalkboard now. I'm using the C's, which is a version of the grays. They have T's, C's, N's, something else. There's a bunch of grays. I personally have found that just the C's and W's are enough for me, picking 2 colors of gray. There's N is the other one, neutrals. So I don't think you need all the grays by any means. And even all the C's, I don't own them all. I own like every other one. So for the chalkboard, I'm using C9, C7, C5. And I'm doing the same thing that I did with the wall. As you can see, very simple techniques. I'm starting with the darkest at the edges and blending into the lightest. In this large area, you're going to see that I have a lot of marker strokes, and it's taking a couple of layers to blend it in. The other option, and this might not even prevent you from doing a lot of layers, is but to work in a smaller area. But also what I like to do when I am using my markers is the flicking technique. And I generally color with a flick, but it can look a little bit different. When I'm trying to cover a large area, I do use my brush tip, not my chisel tip. I almost never use my chisel tip. And what I do is I lay the whole side of the brush tip against my background and I flick out so that where I'm starting, when I start with the marker, it's fully on there. And as I lift the marker up, I just kind of drag it off the page, and that causes there to be a little bit less ink at the edge of the flick, and that helps for there to be a bit more blending. I'm going to just continue with those 3 colors. I don't really want to go any lighter than that, and I did find that when I went back in later as I was trying to fix up the area around the eraser, if I worked in a smaller area, I could get a smoother blend. Here, I'm not getting an amazingly smooth blend. That doesn't really surprise me because I'm working in a large area. I'm not working very carefully. But I think that it creates the look of a kind of dusty, dirty chalkboard. So if you ever use an actual chalkboard, which I'm sure all of you have, when you erase it, it doesn't go completely back to black unless you're, using water or whatever to clean it off. And so I think that that adds to the effect of it looking like a chalkboard in this case. But for if you were coloring something solid black, you probably would want to work it in a little bit smoother. I think that it's important to use grays when you're trying to represent black, because I think if you were to color that entire thing with, say, a 100 marker, it just wouldn't have very much depth to it and wouldn't look as interesting. And here I'm coming in with W's to color the eraser. Most chalkboard erasers that I've seen are black, but if I colored it black, you wouldn't really see it, and I was trying to add a bit of a detail. You could, of course, stamp an accessory if you had one. I think that there may be some accessories with the teacher stamp from Stamp Anniething. I know she has like a little pointer in her hand, but I wanted to draw mine in because I didn't have a stamp that was, the right size or whatever. And I thought that it made it look a little bit more like a chalkboard. And I just used W7, 5, and 3, gave it some darker edges, and it was very simple for that. Next up, I want to talk about the floor and the ledge because they are I'm trying to color them as if they are wood. This is a newer technique for me. I'm not an expert by any means at it, but it's just something I've kind of been experimenting with, having looked at wood and looked at other people's Copic coloring of wood, noticing that there's a couple of different browns and it's not going to be a smooth blend. You're going to have these like lines of color. So I'm using E31, 35, and E29. The E29 is my darkest color, and it might be a little bit hard to tell, but what I'm trying to do here is add just the very lightest, thinnest line. And in order to achieve that, I need to barely touch my marker to the paper. So I'm actually just sort of gliding my hand very gently, very light touch on the marker, like light hold. I'm not, gripping it really tight. And I'm just sort of sweeping it back and forth and sort of letting it like almost accidentally touch the paper as I go by. Like the pressure of like you're not even intending for it to be on there. And that's how I was able to get those thin lines. A light grip I find to be very important to getting thin lines. If you're kind of holding your marker too tight, it's a lot harder to get those light marks and those thin lines. Then the E35, I also went in with strokes, but those I wanted to be bigger. So those were more with the side of my marker and as opposed to the very, very tip. Then I kind of blended it all back in with the E31 to make sure that those lines weren't too prominent. Like you don't really want them to be very clear lines. You want them to sort of blend in a little bit for a more authentic look. Next up, I thought I would go in with a Copic multi-liner to kind of create molding, like the trim that goes around a room. Not that I've ever had one in my classroom, I don't think. There's usually molding. That's too pricey. But I wanted my floor to look a little bit finished here. So that's what I decided to do. And I just felt like the multi-liner wasn't dark enough. So I actually went in with the E29 and I just drew a line there. And it's not really like molding. It's not very thick. You could certainly make it thicker by continuing to draw those lines in. But I thought that it helped create a more clear barrier between the floor and the wall. And I'm going to do the same thing with my T-ruler to create the edges of the ledge that you put the chalk and the erasers on. And like I said before, if you're going to use your T-ruler and your Copic marker, you're going to color your T-ruler. My T-ruler now has brown lines on it. Not a big deal. You can simply, as mentioned earlier, use rubbing alcohol or the colorless blender to get it off. There's a chance it might not come off completely. To me, that's not a big deal. My art tools are meant to be used. If they wind up a little dirty, that's fine as long as they don't spread to the next project. I'm coloring the wood here a little bit different just because I didn't want it to be as detailed as have much interest as the floor. I just wanted it to like look, like it had some sort of wood shape to it or wood color to it. And so I did use the E29 at the edges, blended it out with the E35 into the E31, just like I did with the chalkboard on the wall. Then I added just a tiny bit of detail of the wood look by adding little strips, or I don't know quite the right stripes maybe, of the E35 and the E29. Again, with the E35, I'm going to go in to add the bigger swipes with the side, and the E29, I'm going to go in with the very tip, just so it creates thinner lines. And when I did that, I realized that I didn't add any shadowing to the floor. I'd made the sides darker on the chalkboard, on the wall, on the ledge, and I didn't do it to the floor, which looked a little odd. So I took some E35 and I made the edges of the floor a little bit darker than the rest of the floor, just so it would create a consistent highlight down the center. And the main reason to create that highlight down the center is to add interest, to make it have some depth and dimension, but also to highlight my little girl image that's going to eventually go in the card, because she's going to be a little bit off center, but if your eye's drawn to the light in the center, it'll be drawn to where the edge of her body is and kind of between her and the sentiment. So yeah, that's just kind of my intention of drawing your attention to where I'm going to put the most interesting thing about the card. I was feeling like the eraser was lacking definition, so I tried to go back in with some darker colors. I kind of outlined it with I believe it's a W7. It could have already been all the way to, yeah, it's a W7. Just to give it a little bit more definition. And even though I don't show a tutorial for how to color the little girl, I will tell you the colors that I used for her, like what her hair was, what her dress was, and that kind of thing. I wrote them all down for you. Once I was finished coloring my background image, I decided to cut it out with a cat Scrappiness stitched scallop rectangle die. This is one of my go-tos for when I make large backgrounds because it only trims off the very edge, but it adds a bit of interest. So rather than just cutting it straight or covering the card completely, just a little something. And cat Scrappiness dies are good for that because all of their rectangles, the largest size is just under an A2 size card. So it barely leaves any white, but it, but leaves just enough. Like it's not bigger than a card base. So I decided to stamp my sentiment from the Honeybees stamp set. It's called Beautiful Life and it says Just Smile. I wanted to white heat emboss it because that would look like someone had written it in chalk on the chalkboard. Although I realized you probably wouldn't do like super fancy hand lettering like that on a chalkboard, but this is imaginary. So I'm gonna let it be, just like some of my other imaginary elements so far. So I stamped it in Versamark ink, used an embossing powder bag beforehand, so the embossing powder didn't get where I wanted it. Didn't want it. Sorry. You kind of know the drill for embossing, I'm sure though. Then I heat embossed it once with white embossing powder. Pretty sure I use Hero Arts white embossing powder. Doesn't really matter. Good fine line white embossing will do. And I stamped it again. And the reason I was able to stamp it again in the same exact place is because I used the stamp positioning tool. Happened to use my Misty today. And that meant that it would just look a little bit thicker and more prominent. So I just like that dimension to it. Then I'm going to go in and I'm going to fix up that little bit of chalkboard area that was left white on accident. And I fussy cut out my Stamp Anniething girl. A lot of Stamp Anniething stamps have free SVG files. That's what they're called. And I think it's the owner of Stamp Anniething mentioned that they're going to come out with coordinating dies in 2019. So that's pretty exciting. But in this particular case, I actually wanted the girl to be like cut exactly on the black line. So I fussy cut her out and then I ran a Memento tuxedo black marker all around the edges so that my fussy cutting looked really finished and nice, because sometimes you get a little bit of white if you don't fussy cut perfectly, or even if you do that, the thick cardstock. Because, and I forgot to mention this earlier, I am using 110-pound Recollections Michaels cardstock for all my Copic coloring. It's just what I've gotten used to coloring on. There's plenty of coloring cardstocks out there that work, just a matter of what you're used to. I'm going to attach my girl, and that's going to be it for my card today. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you're interested in more crafting tutorials, be sure to subscribe to my channel. Also, since I'm kind of new to doing Copic background tutorials, please let me know how I could improve. I would appreciate that. And thank you so much for watching. I'll leave you links in the video description below. Have a great day. Bye.